Today, Halifax, largest city here in Nova Scotia, has the highest violent crime rate of any city in Canada, and Nova Scotia has the second highest rate of any province. Nova Scotia's rate of 157 incidents per 1,000 population ranked amongst the highest for violent victimization. This from a government that was going to get tough on crime. This from the government that when home invasions became a serious issue, rather than deal with the problem of youth in our province breaking into people's homes, they instead made a video for seniors showing them how to lock their windows and lock their doors. What a way to deal with the problem. Almost the same way the Minister of Education deals with illiteracy in this province. Get up and say that we're the best educated, forget about the 34,000 that have less than a grade 9 education. Mr. Speaker, violent crime rates are highest in both Alberta and Nova Scotia. Residents of the western provinces generally reported higher rates of victimization, with one exception. Nova Scotia's rate of 157 incidents per 1,000 population ranked among the highest for violent victimization and was similar to the rate of 160 recorded for Alberta. Mr. Speaker, Halifax appeared to contribute to Nova Scotia's high rate of violent victimization. It was the central metropolitan area with the highest rate of violent incidents for every 1,000 of population. Mr. Speaker, residents in the Halifax Regional Municipality and throughout Nova Scotia deserve to have safe communities. They deserve to have a government that takes the issue of crime and vandalism seriously, that follows it up with action and not just talk. Yet, Mr. Speaker, one simply has to look under the justice reforms in the Blue Book to see the many lists of measures that were going to be brought in by the Tory government to address crime in this province and to see that little, if any, of those promises have been kept. Mr. Speaker, this government continues to talk about his rate of job growth here in this province. But Mr. Speaker, we realize that in 2005, according to Statistics Canada, job growth was an anemic 0.2% in the last year. Mr. Speaker, we need to make sure that we have a government that is working towards keeping our economy strong and attracting new employers and employees to this province. But Mr. Speaker, there's a way of being able to do that, and there's a way of being able to make secret deals and hope that Nova Scotians don't notice. Mr. Speaker, while this government has claimed that it was a clean government and that it didn't have any scandals, who would have thought on the way out the door, the former Premier, now member from Pictou Centre, had to have a minister resign over a controversial loan given to a company in his riding. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians were left with a minister who had done business dealings for 27 years tell Nova Scotians he had simply forgotten to tell his cabinet colleagues that he did business with this gentleman before offering up to $250,000 grant, what this government calls a non-forgivable, no-interest loan. Back home, we call that a grant. But obviously, the government has found a new way to try to dress that up. Mr. Speaker, to this day, the government continues to hide behind the facts of what took place in this matter. We had the spectacle of the former Minister of Economic Development, sitting in the Committee on Public Accounts, refusing to answer questions, citing cabinet confidentiality, solicitor-client advice, everything he could think of, rather than be accountable to Nova Scotians, only to watch him walk out those doors, get in front of the media. They asked him the same questions he refused to answer here, and for the most part, he gave them an answer. That's the type of government we've had here, Mr. Speaker. They've hidden behind the information. They've shown a lack of respect for a committee, and yet they walk out in front of the media and they answer the questions they refuse to answer here. Mr. Speaker, on Wednesday, it'll be interesting because the Industrial Expansion Fund will be up for discussion. Mr. Speaker, a fund that this government has managed to use day in, day out through the last few years to be able to give money to companies that somehow didn't meet the smell test of Nova Scotia Business Incorporated, the arm's length agency set up to give out government money with an independent board of directors. The government, the Premier, who said at the time that he would take the politics and the bureaucracy out of government money to business. Yet when we had him here in front of public accounts, and when I put the question to him, when he tried to justify that even with NSBI we still need the Industrial Expansion Fund, Cabinet still needs the ability to give money to organizations, to businesses, and we need to keep having that involvement, he went so far as to say, Mr. Speaker, we still need to keep the politics and bureaucracy in the system of giving out government money. Well, what hypocrisy. After having given speech after speech of saying he would take the politics and the bureaucracy out of giving government money, here he is now, 7 years later, telling us it's necessary to keep that there. So not only do we have a Minister of Economic Development resign, we're still not quite sure why he resigned, because the government won't tell us that, won't tell us what happened at Cabinet or how it took place. Then we have the famous situation with Magic Valley. Mr. Speaker, we now know, as a result of our party's probing and the opposition's party probing of this issue, that the gentleman who owns Magic Valley approached the government saying he needed $3.7 million to turn the operation around and make it profitable. Government bureaucrats laughed. They said it was a dream, a fantasy this gentleman had. It wasn't sustainable, the business plan, they pretty much laughed at it. Yet somehow, knowing the Premier who had lobbied for this while in opposition, knowing he had continued to show a personal interest in this file, even though it's not in his writing, knowing the personal friendship between the Premier and the owner of this operation, somehow Cabinet walked out and said, we're going to offer $350,000 non-repayable, no-interest loan. Yeah. Again, a grant, or, has been referred, a gift. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians were outraged when they found out the true details of what took place. And yet to this day, we still don't have all the details, because the government continues to hide behind solicitor-client privilege, behind cabinet confidentiality, even though we have legal opinions from the Chief Legislative Counsel, which tells us that the government's arguments don't hold any water, and that legislative tradition says that the committees have the power to get that information and then make a determination whether it meets the test of cabinet confidentiality or public interest immunity or solicitor-client privilege. Yet the government continues to stonewall and continues to hide behind that. And I would tell you, Mr. Speaker, that potato gate has been referred to, and Magic Valley will haunt the Conservative government during the next election campaign, because Nova Scotians will not forget the flagrant abuse of their dollars that took place with that Magic Valley. And I could speak just on that for the rest of my time, Mr. Speaker, but again, allow me to refer to some of the other matters we heard about in the throne speech. Mr. Speaker, even before the throne speech, attending the Halifax Chamber of Commerce luncheon last week, we had the Minister of Finance announce to us that the Tory government, if re-elected, will increase the basic personal exemption starting in 2007. Well now, Mr. Speaker, our party has been talking about this issue since 2000, when we were talking about bracket creep, where the federal government was de-indexing the personal income tax brackets and the provincial government wasn't passing on the savings. I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, trying to explain bracket creep back then was impossible. Trying to explain it today hasn't gotten much easier. But I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that Nova Scotians, especially Nova Scotia businesses, because of the lobbying efforts from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, had made them aware that Nova Scotia has the lowest basic personal exemption in the country. PEI has a higher rate than we do. Newfoundland has a higher rate than we do. Yet the government has kept that low because it's brought in additional revenue. I wouldn't say that they've been reaping a windfall, because the ministers will stand and say that that's not true, although all Nova Scotians know that that is the case. So the question became, why 2007? Why not 2006? So here we were, if I'm not mistaken, this would have been May the, we started here, this would have been May the 2nd. We started here May 4th. So May the 2nd, we had the Minister of Finance tell the press, we couldn't do it for 2006 because we would have had to let Revenue Canada know of these changes by the month of April. So a mere weeks before he's announcing this, he's telling us a few weeks later he missed the deadline. Now, Mr. Speaker, doesn't this bring us all back to 2003, the election campaign that summer where the government said, we're going to give you a 10% tax cut, but we didn't let Revenue Canada know in time, so we can't give it to you on this year's taxes, so instead we're going to send you out a check. The famous $155 check. Again, the government missed a deadline with Revenue Canada. Doesn't that have a similar ring to it? Nova Scotians got fooled into believing they would get a 10% tax cut. Only one party stood and said we could not afford that tax cut. The NDP said it would be political suicide to oppose that tax cut, knowing our province couldn't afford it, knowing it would sacrifice many social programs, knowing the risk it would put our finances. Their leader did not have the fortitude to stand in his place and to oppose that tax cut. And Mr. Speaker, we opposed that tax cut. Maybe we paid a price for opposing that tax cut. But you know what, Mr. Speaker? We stood for the best interests of Nova Scotians because at the end of the day, the government had to reverse that tax cut, had to go through the embarrassment of reversing that tax cut because they knew that it wasn't sustainable and they knew that it wasn't something that Nova Scotians could afford at the time. So here we find ourselves all over again with the Tory party telling us, if you elect us, we're going to give you a tax cut by raising the basic personal exemption. Mr. Speaker, as I said to the media then, as I say now, Nova Scotians were fooled once by this government and by the Tory party. I certainly hope they will not allow themselves to be fooled again by the false promises that the government is promising to make on the issue of the basic personal exemption. Mr. Speaker, it's interesting because the NDP have been silent on this issue, knowing, again, that the government, the Tory party, had proposed a tax cut they had to rescind. Now that they're proposing other tax cuts, again, knowing that they've given themselves enough time to rescind this tax cut because they have till 2007, it's interesting again to see what this government is going to do, and again, whether the NDP will continue to be silent on that issue. Mr. Speaker, tomorrow we wait to see what the budget will bring here in Nova Scotia. As usual, the government has pretty much given Nova Scotians a good indication of what will be contained in the budget. There may be a few surprises, but for the most part, we see that the government is going to bring tomorrow more gifts, promises of tax cuts, and spending in every area imaginable to try once again to have Nova Scotians vote for them by having their votes purchased with their own money. Mr. Speaker, hopefully Nova Scotians will have learned from what the Tories did the last time. Mr. Speaker, there was an opportunity, and in many provinces it is said that minority government has been good for the people and that has worked. Mr. Speaker, minority government in Nova Scotia had great opportunity, and I would submit to you it had few successes. The government continued to govern as if they had a majority, and as long as they threw a few crumbs towards the NDP, they knew that they would be complacent in their support for the government. Mr. Speaker, we had opportunities to make minority government work. Our party pushed the government to address Nova Scotians' concerns, but at the end of the day, we were the lone voice in this House as the NDP made it clear that they were prepared to have their support pretty much purchased with a few promises. You know, Mr. Speaker, if we look back through history, we had the NDP tell the government, if you allow long-term care to no longer be able to claw back assets or to pay for seniors' long-term care, we'll vote for your budget. They did. Now we have the NDP that is saying, if the HST is taking off of home heating oil, they'll vote for the budget again. You know, Mr. Speaker, where's the issues on health care? Where's the support for education? Where's the support for roads? Where's the support for Nova Scotia's most needy? Mr. Speaker, they have proven themselves to be a 1 to 2 trick pony. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? Their tricks are over. Because, Mr. Speaker, when we had the throne speech given, the leader of the NDP announced that the government had stolen his ideas of regulation, and the only issue that was left is the issue of removing the HST on oil. Mr. Speaker, the relevance that is left for the NDP here in this province, Mr. Speaker, is questionable, and we'll see following the next election just how much Nova Scotians still feel the need to send members of that party here in this legislature. You know, Mr. Speaker, it's interesting because I sat here and I listened to the leader of the opposition give his reply, and I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, the members of our caucus certainly showed respect during his reply. Regardless of some of his comments, we certainly showed some respect to him. And it's quite interesting, Mr. Speaker, at the spectacle that we are getting from the official opposition here this evening, Mr. Speaker, when a member is trying to give his reply here in the legislature. So I think that again says more, Mr. Speaker, about just how these points are hitting home than anything else. Mr. Speaker, we realize, Mr. Speaker, that this government is the same government that has overseen the decline of our tourism industry. They have seen almost the complete demise of our offshore industry, and they have overseen the depopulation of our rural communities at an alarming rate. Mr. Speaker, what is worse is we need change, even change from a new Premier, because that Premier has shown us that he's bringing us back into the 1980s rather than moving us forward by trying again to buy his way back into power with Nova Scotians' own money. Mr. Speaker, allow me, being that this will probably be my only opportunity, not only as leader in the House for the Liberal Party, but as the MLA for Richmond, to be able to reply to the speech from the throne during this session, that I want to take the opportunity, Mr. Speaker, on March 24th, 1998, I and a few members of this House, along with you, Mr. Speaker, celebrated our 8-year anniversary as members of this legislature. 3 elections later, our constituents have seen fit to return us back to this House to continue to represent them. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, it's still a great honor for me to stand in my place to speak as the MLA for Richmond County. During 8 years, we have had many challenges, but at the same time, we have had numerous successes. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, as we approach a possible campaign, I look forward again to going to seeing the people of Richmond County, to ask for their continued support, to be able to talk to them about issues such as healthcare, to talk to them about how often I've raised the issue of the Straight Richmond Hospital here in this House, to talk to them about how often I raised the issue of the Richmond Villa in this House. And now to know that as we speak, Mr. Speaker, a new Richmond Villa is being constructed in Richmond County, in St. Peters, as promised. And I'm pleased the former Minister of Health and the former Minister of Health, I know, were supportive of that. It took a little bit to get there, Mr. Speaker, a little longer, but it's under construction, and I look forward to the opening that's going to take place in August or September of this year. Mr. Speaker, I look forward to the debate that comes forward. I believe that our party is going to show Nova Scotians that we can present a plan that better meets the needs of all Nova Scotians, allows them and their families to be able to thrive, allows our students to afford education, allows our seniors to live in comfort, allow our province to prosper. I believe Nova Scotians will see that the Liberal plan allows them to do that, and I look forward to debating that in the next days and weeks ahead. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll recognize the honourable member for Cape Breton Nova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure to rise tonight and speak on the throne speech, Mr. Speaker. And the first item I'd like to address, and that was my government's firm and full commitment, Mr. Speaker. Firm commitment, Mr. Speaker. Commitment to what? Almost 7 years of government, what have they been committed to, Mr. Speaker? Not too much, Mr. Speaker. Health care, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker. Supporting families, strengthening communities, building brighter futures. And I'll go with a text out of that page, Mr. Speaker. And the quality of our air and water are just a few. Could you imagine the quality of air and water in strip mine in Bullingdry Island and Ponecony? Could you imagine the water table when they're finished gutting that beautiful part of Cape Breton Island? Can you imagine that, Mr. Speaker? The devastation of strip mining, the scar it would leave. Portable water will be nowhere for the people that live over there, Mr. Speaker. That's a full commitment, Mr. Speaker. Strengthening our communities. Strengthening your communities. And I'll give you another sentence out of that, Mr. Speaker. It is why we will provide more Nova Scotians with affordable housing. The same government that cut 50% of the housing budget in 2003, Mr. Speaker, and now they're going to commit it to more affordable housing. How many units did that government build in Cape Breton, Mr. Speaker? None. Not one unit was built in Cape Breton Island, Mr. Speaker, and they're committed to affordable housing.
I agree,
Shame.
they are.
One. Not one unit, Mr. Speaker.
Be careful.
They spent all of their money, Mr. Speaker, on rent subsidies. Rent subsidies and giving private developers money to build units, Mr. Speaker. And by the way, in 10 years' time, those units will be turned over to the private development, and he can do whatever he wants to do with them. So where's the affordable housing program when business people are getting rich in private developments, Mr. Speaker? And the poorest of the poor, the seniors, people with disabilities have nowhere to live. That's why we have such a high homeless rate in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, because of that irresponsibility of the people across from me, Mr. Speaker. And increasing funding, Mr. Speaker, is also mentioned in the budget for seniors and low-income housing repairs. What I'd like to know, Mr. Speaker, when people come into your office as an MLA and ask you for a grant application for repairs, and a senior citizen couple living on a meager income of $23,000 per year, they can't qualify for that grant, Mr. Speaker. They do not qualify because they're $100 over. Because they're $100 over. Mr. Speaker, I tabled a bill tonight to hopefully deal with some of those problems, Mr. Speaker, but I don't think we're going to be around long enough to debate that bill. It's a good bill, but we're not going to be around long enough to debate it. Raise the shelter allowance for income assistance recipients. The shelter allowance. It's pretty difficult. They're going to raise the shelter allowance when they give them $190 to live on a month, Mr. Speaker. $190 for food to live on a month, and they're going to raise the shelter allowance. I'd like to see a member of the government live off $190 a month for food, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to see somebody in that party do it. Mr. Speaker, and there was another thing I said, communities, the backbone of Nova Scotia. Communities, the backbone of Nova Scotia. A minister responsible for, they're going to create a minister responsible for volunteerism. When they've created such a need for volunteerism because of all the government cutbacks, every nonprofit organization in this province is cut to the bone. No wonder we have so many people that are volunteering, because these are services that were once provided that are no longer provided by this government, Mr. Speaker. They have no jobs, so they have lots of time to volunteer. And talk about it. I mean, Cape Breton Island has become a suburb of Fort McMurray. That's all we are. It's a suburb of Fort McMurray, Mr. Speaker. That's all we became down there, Mr. Speaker. It's a shame. Why? Because because Sydney Steele. Who'll remember the famous postcard from 1999? Who'll remember the postcard? We'll close Sydney Steele and open more hospital beds. Well, I'd like to see somebody stand up over there and the health minister tell me how many hospitals he opened after he closed Sydney Steele, and the unfair things that they've done to the former workers that are still left on the site. And they bring outside workers in Quebec to do jobs that these guys are capable of doing. How much money has Ernst & Young made off the backs of the people in Cape Breton? How much money? Stand up in their place and tell us how much money they've made, Ernst & Young. Millions of dollars to companies like that, Mr. Speaker, off the backs of steel workers. Off the backs of steel workers. And they talk about, we're going to have youth attendance center. You know, is that going to be like a report card once a month? How are they going to do that, Mr. Speaker? The underlying problem here, Mr. Speaker, is not to do with youth attendance center. It's providing people that live on poverty, domestic violence, and addictions. Go to the underlying causes, which we have young people in trouble in this province today, Mr. Speaker, by the lack of funding for boys and girls clubs and youth centers to provide constructive programming to young people so they won't be out on the streets committing crime. That's the problem, Mr. Speaker. These organizations are living from grant to grant. There's no money out there for funding to provide, for core funding, to provide programs for young people. Constructive programming so young people can grow up to be good, productive citizens in society, Mr. Speaker. Let's deal with the underlying problems. They have to get on their knees and beg every year, as an executive director of a youth center, to stand in this legislature and say that I've written to 3 separate community services minister looking for core funding to help staff a facility to provide those programs that will keep young people out of trouble, Mr. Speaker. And each and every time you're told, you have to go see the regional officer. You have to go see the regional officer. You know, Go see the regional director for community services,
One of them
Mr.
must have
Speaker.
been a Liberal
You know,
community
well, absolutely. You know, in 1997.
Had to be.
You know,
Had to
Mr.
be,
Speaker,
both parties.
it's a shame when they talk about, you know, youth attendance and youth crime. You know what I mean? And here they are the other day, the Minister of Justice stood up in this legislature and introduced all kinds of bills to deal with justice. Deal with the underlying problem. Provide the proper funding for organizations to do constructive things with young people today. Don't undermine them. And there's a policy in community services when you're between the ages of 16 and 18 years of age.
David Morris.
Where do these young people sit? They live from Chesterfield to Chesterfield or home to home. Because this government, when you go to community service and you say, a young person 17 years of age has nowhere to live. Well, it's like going through 900-page document to find out where can this young person go. The caseworker says, no, we got to try the grandmother, you got to try the great aunt, you got to try the great uncle, you got to try the next door neighbor to find them somewhere to live. Instead of providing them a safe environment and safe shelter, no way they'll do this because of that age group. These children between the ages and young people between 16 and 18 have nowheres. This government has failed miserably. They're talking about falling between the cracks. Well, Mr. Speaker, they're falling between the cracks each and every day that we sit in this legislature. And as elected officials, Mr. Speaker, that's not fair. It's not fair to members of society. It's not fair to young people. It's not fair to communities. Building safer communities. Well, that's one way of building a safer community, Mr. Speaker, is keeping young people happy and busy. Busy hands are happy hands. Productive young people in society, Mr. Speaker. And I'll go on to the next issue of the throne speech, is learning the gateway to success. Mr. Speaker, the gateway to success. My government will also support the diverse needs of our students and will take further actions to implement the recommendations of the Black Learners Advisory Committee. Now, do anybody here remember that? I think the BLAC report was introduced in December of 1994, Mr. Speaker. And one of the first documents that I was handed when I came into this legislature was the report of the BLAC Implementation Review Committee in September in 2003, Mr. Speaker. What has been implemented? Nothing.
Who's been in government?
You know, and who's been in government, Mr. Speaker? What has been implemented? And now they're saying, well, we're going to create an office of African Nova Scotian, an outreach office in the community in Cape Breton Island. Well, let's see if this government will step up to the plate, and the Minister of Transportation and Public Works will put that office in the community of Whitney Pier, the largest black community outside of the metro area. Let's see them step up to the plate and put that office where that office belongs, Mr. Speaker. Let's not play politics with it. Put it where it belongs. Implementing the Black Report, Mr. Speaker. That's terrible. 1/3 of, how many of those recommendations? 48 recommendations. Somebody over there stand up and tell me how many of them they implemented. How many did they implement in this legislature? Shameful. And they'll talk about learning gateways to success, Mr. Speaker. You know, must be an election coming, Mr. Speaker. I can't wait till I knock on my community's doors, Mr. Speaker, and tell them how many of those recommendations that they implemented next week, Mr. Speaker. And I'll start off in the community where I love, Mr. Speaker, and I love to be, and tell the people this is what this government has done, Mr. Speaker. Nothing. And I'll give you another part. Promoting good health, protecting public health, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, Nova Scotia has among the highest chronic disease and disability rates in the country. Mr. Speaker, they've told us for years and years in Cape Breton, you smoke too many cigarettes, you drink too much rum, and you eat too much bologna. Mr. Speaker, that's what's wrong with the people in Nova Scotia. You know what I mean? That's the truth,
That's
Mr. Speaker.
That's
It's
my
got nothing to
favorite.
do, Mr. Speaker, with this government's environmental record. I touched on it a little earlier about strip mining, Mr. Speaker. Well, let's move on to putting an incinerator in my riding, Mr. Speaker, to burn PCBs and PAHs. Everybody in Cape Breton had told them when they had the JAG report that they didn't want the incineration of PCBs and PAHs in their community. Mr. Speaker, where are we at today? This government and JAG made those recommendations, and the people of the community do not want to burn PCBs and PAHs. Do the right thing here, Mr. Speaker. And the government should say, you know, let's burn that in Inverness. I say we take the mobile incinerator, we put it up in Inverness, and we burn it up there, Mr. Speaker. It's a good Cape Breton premier. I think that the best thing he could do is take that mobile incinerator and burn those PCBs and PAHs in his riding, Mr. Speaker. Wouldn't that be good? That would be great for everybody. That's a good way to show leadership in Cape Breton Island to get more votes, Mr. Speaker. You know, take the bull by the horns in this matter and take it up there. And let's go on, Mr. Speaker. When I sat in this legislature and I bought a rag in here one day full of coal dust. Full of coal dust, and the page refused to pick it up. because they didn't know what was on the rag, Mr. Speaker. If I didn't get a phone call this morning to the MLA, there's coal dust all over the neighborhood again, Mr. Speaker. So you say to the Department of the Environment, coal dust again. It must be coming from the roads. It must be coming from somewhere else. It's not coming from Cisco. It's not, oh, Cisco's not there anymore. That's right, they shut it down. Mr. Speaker, it's coming from Provincial Energy Ventures. It's coming from Logitech. It's coming from whatever. They don't know where it's coming from. It's falling out of the sky, I guess, Mr. Speaker. And here are these people being exposed. And let's go talk about arsenic and lead in the soil in the community, Mr. Speaker. I mean, arsenic, you can bathe arsenic and lead. I think the former Speaker of this legislature years back, the fellow that represented Cape Breton Nova, said a spoonful of arsenic now and then wouldn't hurt anybody, Mr. Speaker. And I think that was years ago, Mr. Speaker.
Liberal, was he?
So here it is, Mr. Speaker. We have the soil full of arsenic and lead. What has this government done to do with this, Mr.
Was he a
Speaker?
Liberal?
Mr. Speaker, well, let's talk about what we talked about, Mr. Speaker, was the PCBs, the strip mining, the coal dust. Now let's go to another issue. Asbestos in public housing, Mr. Speaker. Asbestos in public housing in my riding, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, they knew about this report since October the 25th, 2005, Mr. Speaker. And what did this government agency do? Told nobody. The people, they put new chimneys in 93 units in the terraces in Ashby and the Pier. They went through the chimneys, new chimneys through the ceilings, through the attics and new roofs. Mr. Speaker, all that vermiculite, which contains asbestos, which they would admit over there, it contains asbestos. They have bulk samples back and they know the report that it's over to Health Canada Limited, asbestos. Mr. Speaker, as I talked about earlier about PAHs and PCBs, they're not quite too sure if they cause cancer. But I'm going to tell you, Mr. Speaker, there's one substance known to mankind that causes cancer, 100%, and that's asbestos. 100% causes cancer, Mr. Speaker, and the people in these units were exposed to that when these units were under construction. The acting medical director, Dr. Roberts, sent them a letter, Mr. Speaker, and said to them, you know, you're at low risk only if it's disturbed. The Minister of Community Services flies into Cape Breton. By the way, didn't tell anybody. Every reporter in Cape Breton was wondering where the minister. Did you know the MLA from Cape Breton Nova didn't know he was in town? He got called. So he calls the cabinet office to find out, oh, he's in meetings. So he comes in and he flies back out of town. And when he gets, the reporters finally get a hold of him. He's landing in the Halifax airport and he says, well, you know, we got a couple of bulk samples back that are 1.6%. Well, that's over the allowable limit for asbestos in Canada. So when they did the construction on these units and all that dust and vermiculite was in the air, Mr. Speaker, these people were exposed to a human carcinogenic, Mr. Speaker. And the shame on this part of it is that it takes years and years for it to develop in mesothelioma, lung cancer, asbestosis, cancer of the lining of the lung. This is what happens. This doesn't happen right away. This happens years and years down the road, Mr. Speaker. This is what they call a bystander part of the asbestos. Bystander means that, Mr. Speaker, in Libby, Montana, where this asbestos was mined, the workers were coming home and they had it on their clothes. The women were washing their clothes. Years down the road, the women die of cancer. Workers in Ontario, Mr. Speaker, working at asbestos plants coming home. And there was an article 2 weeks ago I think it was the Mail, in the Toronto, the Mail Star, the Toronto Star. And the article said, the 16-year-old does not reach his birthday. He dies of mesothelioma. His father worked in an asbestos plant. What is this government going to do about the people that were exposed to asbestos, Mr. Speaker? All they keep saying is that only at risk if it was disturbed. Does anybody over there get the fact that these people lived in these homes and that when they were cutting holes through the ceilings, the place was pouring down, and the people living there were cleaning it up, vacuuming, cleaning it up, sweeping it up? And what do they keep saying? Only at a low risk if you disturb it. Well, what do you got to do to disturb it, Mr. Speaker? What do you have to do to disturb it? It fell down, they swept it up. So they come back in, and a lady says to me last week, she said, to her MLA, she said, they came in, she said, and I asked them, they did a test in my living room. And I said, no, I said, how about testing the furnace room where the stuff is falling down? Oh, no, we were told to test it here. They were told to test it there. Don't test it where it's at, but test it there. Who made this all up? And here they are, Mr. Speaker. And let me perfectly say that, and this all happened, Mr. Speaker, on October the 25th, and they didn't notify anybody. You know, they didn't tell anybody, Mr. Speaker, until I brought it out publicly on Friday, April the 7th, Mr. Speaker, until I advised the media what was going on, Mr. Speaker, with this issue. And they said, we're going to have 2 of our members of community services, we're going to go in and we're going to investigate. They're going to investigate. So they appoint this Mr. David Ryan at Halifax Community Services, and lo and behold, they appoint Mr. Cyril LeBlanc, who is the regional director now for community services. So people are at a community meeting, they're saying, well, you know, so Mr. LeBlanc is sitting there not saying anything. And I said, well, as of April the 1st, he was the regional director. What was his job before April the 1st? Yeah. He was the director for housing for Cape Breton Island, Mr. Speaker. So he's doing the investigation, Mr. Speaker. Could you imagine if I had misconduct as an MLA and Darrell Dexter appointed me to investigate myself, Mr. Speaker? That would just, the fox in charge of the hen house again, Mr. Speaker. These are people that were exposed to asbestos. Exposed to asbestos, Mr. Speaker. A very serious issue, and I don't hear anything from the Minister of Community Services, the Minister of the Environment, or anybody over there telling those people or advising those people of the health issue, Mr. Speaker. And this is the way that says promoting good health and protecting public health. Is it not the acting? We don't have a regional, we don't have a doctor anymore, Mr. Speaker. What do they call the health? Dr. Badenhorst was the regional doctor there, and he had left on Thursday before all this happened. So now we have an acting regional, acting regional medical officer under Dr. Jeff Stoff. Thank you, the Minister for Health. And Ann Roberts had sent, and Ann Roberts is actually the acting minister, acting. You know what you mean. Okay. She's the acting medical officer of health for Cape Breton Island, because we don't have one right now. In a time of need, when people were exposed to one of the most dangerous human carcinogenics known to mankind, 100% sure that causes cancer, nothing else. 100% sure causes cancer. Not now, maybe 10 years, maybe 15 years, Mr. Speaker, but causes cancer. So that's promoting good health and protecting public health in this throne speech, Mr. Speaker. That's good health. Mr. Speaker, they talk about in the next issue of the throne speech, meeting Nova Scotia's health care needs. That's a lovely title. Mr. Speaker, when they can take a senior citizen that's looking for nursing home care and put her 100 kilometers. So I have a lady in my community of African Nova Scotian descent. They put her in Richmond, Mr. Speaker. In Richmond, the Richmond Villa. It's within the limit of 100 kilometers. That's meeting Nova Scotia health care needs. They take another lady who lives in Shetty Camp and puts her in Sydney. Now, she cannot receive the services in her own language. It's 100 kilometers away, and how can she receive the services that she needs in her own language, in French? She can't. So again, that's meeting Nova Scotia's health care needs, Mr. Speaker. But I guess it was Gaelic that meet their needs, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, shaping the future of continuing care, Mr. Speaker. Ship them 100 kilometers away because they just got too many beds. Mr. Speaker, what they have to do is rely on getting these people out of the hospitals and creating more long-term beds in the province of Nova Scotia. We need long-term beds for our aging population in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. You know, Mr. Speaker, building optimism, a better business climate. Well, I'm not going to go there because the member in the other party, Mr. Speaker, just talked about the optimism in the building better business climate with the Magic Valley and the Potato Gate incident, Mr. Speaker. I'm not going to go with building a better business climate there, you know. I'm just going to leave that up to the next member from the Liberal Party to deal with that, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
I wouldn't do that if I
Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia Resources, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotia Resources, Mr. Speaker. The next heading, I think, in the throne speech, Nova Scotia Resources Industry adapting to trains. My government believes a prosperous future depends on careful management of our natural resources. Bring out the strip miner, Mr. Speaker. Bring it out. 160 feet down. I mean, we're going to look after the management of our natural resources. We got a Duncan mine there to go back to coal mining underground, Mr. Speaker. The proper way to mine coal. Let's get it done, Mr. Speaker. Why tear up beautiful Point of Colney and Bullentree Island? Mr. Speaker, that is very good for tourism. I can just see an eco-tourism now in a 160-foot hole in the middle of Cape Breton Island, Mr. Speaker. Can you imagine? Well, would you take a canoe down to that water, Mr. Speaker? Wildlife, I'll go on to the minerals. Wildlife. You imagine the wildlife around there. Now, I remember touring that site one day with my leader, Mr. Dexter, and the member from Dartmouth East, and the member from Hants East, and my member at Dartmouth North, and the member from Cape Breton Centre. And we saw 2 deer there, Mr. Speaker. Beautiful 2 deer over there in Point of Coney. And there was the deer over on one side, and there was this pile of, I don't know what slag, I would call slag because I'm a steel worker, a former steel worker, tailings or trailings of the mine, and this pool of water. I've never seen a color like that before. I think I saw it a long time ago when I was a young fellow. I used to look in the, in the telescope, you know, and look at the moon. It kind of looked like that. It was really weird, the big hole like that, a moonscape, because that's what the strip mining did to that part of the island. But we're supposed to say that, you know, this government believes a prosperous future also depends on careful management of our natural resources.
Were there any fish
Imagine, how many fish were in that water, Mr. Speaker? How many fish would be living in that water? How many of the, what about the lobster fishery? What about the agriculture? What about all those other things that's going to happen there, Mr. Speaker? To create how many jobs, Mr. Speaker? How many jobs and economic benefits is this project going to bring to Cape Breton Island?
None for fisheries, that's for sure.
You know, Mr. Speaker, how many jobs, eh? Mr. Speaker, again, I talked about the opening a satellite office, Mr. Speaker. Let's see if this government will do the right thing and open an office of African Nova Scotian satellite office in the community of Whitney Pier where it belongs. Where it should be, Mr. Speaker, with easy access. Let's not go to the downtown area where people will have to walk or take a bus or too far away from the community, Mr. Speaker. Let's do the proper thing here, right? Our environment, our energy, our people, and our products. That's a lovely heading, Mr. Speaker. That is just beautiful. I mean, I'm looking at towards a sustainable environment. Could you imagine the government of Nova Scotia offering ecosystem tours of the beautiful Bullendree Island and Bird Island, Mr. Speaker? Could you imagine after what's going to happen over there, an ecosystem tour? I cannot understand, Mr. Speaker, how this government can actually say that strip mining, I guess in a sense, Mr. Speaker, I guess we'd call it environmental prejudice. I mean, what other part of this province where you'd have coal dust, arsenic and lead in the soil, incineration of PCBs, asbestos in vermiculite asbestos in attics of public housing? Where else would that happen? Would that happen anywhere else? But I'm glad that we have a new Cape Breton Premier. So he can tell the people of Cape Breton Island he's going to take that mobile incinerator and burn the PCBs and the PAHs in Inverness County where they belong, Mr. Speaker. And that'll show leadership to the people of Cape Breton Island. That'll show leadership by doing those things.
No burning.
No burn, no burn. Let's show leadership out there to do that. You know, Mr. Speaker, there's some good things I guess I could say in the budget, but I can't find too many. They did, my first speech from the throne, when I was first elected, there was never a mention of Cape Breton Island. But now we have a Cape Breton Premier, so he mentioned it once. So I guess myself, as a Cape Bretoner, I should be very happy with that aspect that he mentioned it once. So once, he did, once, it was once, I'm telling you, once. That's a big improvement from the last Premier.
What did he say? What did he say?
He just said, you know, that once that he was going to create an office of African Nova Scotian in Cape Breton Island. So and that's it. I mean, that's what he's going to do for Cape Breton Island. I mean, so he's going to housing. I mean, how many units of affordable housing did they build in Cape Breton Island? None. Not one. Not one. And they put affordable, I'm glad to see affordable housing in this document. But how many times are the people of Nova Scotia and the people of Cape Breton Island going to get fooled by this? I'd like to see for a minister to stand up over there in community services and tell me how many people are living in the new affordable houses that they built in Cape Breton Island. If he can show me here tomorrow, or in the next few days that we still have remaining here, how many tenants that are living in new affordable housing units built in Cape Breton? How many? None. Not one, Mr. Speaker. It's a shame. Not one. Not one person. Not one. They spent $37.3 million, and we still don't have a unit in Cape Breton. We got $18.9 million left in the affordable housing budget, and now they're going to say that we're going to do and build affordable housing. 18.9. Not one. No, I'm sure he's a Cape Breton Premier. I'm pretty sure.
Does he sing out on the Myra?
No. I'm just saying. I mean, you know, Mr. Speaker, I'm just trying to think, Mr. Speaker. We mentioned some things. You're supposed to stand up on the speech from the throne and say, you know, positive things about your riding. I wish I could stand in my place here as a member of the Legislative Assembly and say, look, I'm proud to have coal dust. I'm proud to have PCBs and PAHs. I'm proud to have asbestos. I'm proud to have arsenic and lead. Where else would this be tolerated? In Canada. Where else in Nova Scotia would this be tolerated? I mean, where would it be tolerated at? Nowhere. Can the people not see the environmental prejudice in which that community in Cape Breton Nova is under? What have they done to deal with any of those issues the time that they've been in power for almost 7 years?
They get great
What have they done?
representation, and that's why you're here fighting.
You know, that's why I'm in this legislature, elected by the people of Cape Breton Nova, to point these out, Mr. Speaker, to tell the people. And they talk about, Mr. Speaker, and I also read the budget. I seen in there is going to be a tax credit for children that play. I have an 11-year-old boy, Daniel, who plays sports. And a lot of kids in my neighborhood like Tori and Brandon and Brett and Kenzie and yeah, he's got a lot of friends, yeah. So, I mean, he plays hockey, plays baseball. I'm fortunate, you know, Mr. Speaker, and I'm fortunate that he plays hockey, and I'm fortunate. So I guess, I mean, what about the people that can't afford to pay for their children to play hockey, can't afford the equipment, they don't play? And then we wonder again, we go back to that issue again about getting young people involved. When busy hands are happy hands. When you're marching, you're not fighting, Mr. Speaker. When those kids are playing ball, or those kids are playing soccer, or those kids are playing sports of any kind, they learn team sports, they learn camaraderie. I have many friends, Mr. Speaker, over sports for many years, and I think a lot of children can learn a lesson by playing sports, by getting involved in sports. And this was the Premier, was a phys ed teacher who's now committed to bringing physical education back to high school. That's right. Physical education. I wonder whose idea that was. You know, I think that was another one. I remember the cartoon back in the paper. Maybe I'm not supposed to say this. Don't throw me out, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to say, Mr. Speaker, the cartoon was it was a picture of John Hamm, and it had Mr. Hamm is retiring after implementing Darrell Dexter's policy. So I'm just wondering. I'm sorry. It was a member from Pictou, Mr. Speaker.
No.
I'm sorry, the member from Pictou, at this time it was, Mr. Speaker. So I'm just wondering if we're going to have that same caption with the new Premier implementing NDP policies, Mr. Speaker. You know, compulsory phys ed, long-term gas regulations. Maybe the possibility, imagine the possibility of doing the right thing by taking the GST off home heating essentials. An NDP thing. Mr. Speaker, I did a press conference with my colleague and the member from Dartmouth, the member from Sackville, Cobequid, and myself and Peter Stafford, the MP from Eastern Passage, Eastern Shore, Mr. Speaker, the MP, in December the 5th of 2004 in Ottawa, a joint press conference on the removal of HST off home heating essentials. In Ottawa, Mr. Speaker. And they said that you couldn't do that. That government over there said it couldn't be done back there. It would be a miracle if it could be done now, Mr. Speaker. It would be a miracle. You imagine they can stand up and say, we can remove that, Mr. Speaker. Huh? It was, you know what I mean, Mr. Speaker? Then I can talk about, well, you know, politics is strange. You know, you end up fighting for people to get a new bridge in your riding, Mr. Speaker. You know, $983,000 bridge in your riding, Mr. Speaker. The people were still upset at this government because they had to drive 25 kilometers around, and the gas prices went from 92 cents to $1.10, and the constituents were bringing in bills to me. Who's going to pay for this gas? You know, driving for 30 days, I forget how it was, I guess it was 60 days or whatever, within a certain length of time, and the gas that it cost them, Mr. Speaker. But I'll tell you, the bridge is beautiful. It'll be there long after I'm dead and gone off this planet. I'll tell you that, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, they talk about, you know, doing the right thing is focusing on providing enough money, Mr. Speaker, for programming for young people. Do not make these nonprofit organizations and people live from grant to grant in transition houses, boys and girls clubs. You know, volunteers. A minister of volunteerism. I never fell out of the chair when they announced that one in the throne speech the other day.
You near what?
A minister.
Say it again.
I never fell off my chair in my place, Mister. I never fell off because volunteerism. Minister of volunteerism. I'm still shocked over that one. I guess I'll use that on the campaign too. That, you know, The Minister of Volunteerism. I mean, that's a good one. And the Minister of Gaelic. I wonder where that comes from. A Minister of Gaelic. I better not be too saucy on that one, as my mother's a McNeil, Mr. Speaker, and she'd be quite upset with me, I guess, with my heritage. But, Mr. Speaker, speech from the throne, Mr. Speaker. There's so many things that this government could have done, Mr. Speaker, when they did a speech from the throne and addressed so many other issues, Mr. Speaker. But there's no other riding where you'll see environmental prejudice in the province of Nova Scotia. Environmental prejudice, Mr. Speaker. Strip mining, asbestos, tar ponds, PCBs, PAHs. I'm just wondering, Mr. Speaker, what other people in the province of Nova Scotia would put up with that, Mr. Speaker? I'd like to see that being down in the beautiful Musquodoboit Valley, a PCB incinerator, Mr. Speaker, or Bedford, or anything like that. See how many of the people over there. I mean, you know, I'd like to see them, how they would react. Say we're going to put a mobile incinerator
In Antigonish.
in Antigonish. I mean, I'd like to see the people in Antigonish, God bless my Aunt Florence, when they're going to burn PCBs in her backyard in Antigonish. It'll never happen. The only place it's going to happen is in Cape Breton Nova. Coal dust, asbestos, PCBs, and a mobile incinerator. Dioxins and furans, Mr. Speaker, in the air. We've been poisoned for over 100 years in that community. When is this government going to stop the abuse to the people of Cape Breton Nova, Mr. Speaker? When is it going to stop, Mr. Speaker? When is it going to stop? Mr. Speaker, we all know in this legislature, Mr. Speaker, there's an election coming up very soon. And the candidate for that party over there works for housing. For housing. So I like to see him when he's knocking on the doors looking for votes, telling them about the asbestos in their insulation, Mr. Speaker. And they were at low risk because his friends in that government that he's going to run for told him, you're at low risk only if it's disturbed. So let's see when he knocks on their doors and tell them, you know. And I like to see his campaign literature stating, you know, island housing.
How many units?
How many units? Now I found on the weekend, there was an article in the weekend, 20 more units. Wolfville, Middleton, and Antigonish. How many units are there going to be? When is this government going to, when is the Minister of Community Services going to do an audit on housing, Mr. Speaker, an audit on housing to determine how safe these units are for people in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker? When is it going to be? They hit it. That department knew on October the 25th of 2005. Where did that report go, Mr. Speaker? Did somebody in that department knows where that report went? And let's see what kind of PR or what kind of CRY they're going to do, Mr. Speaker. And you know what the CRY is? CRY is? It's cover your ear acronym, Mr. Speaker. And that's what they're good at, Mr. Speaker. And that's what that department is good at in community services, Mr. Speaker. That minister,
Yes, the CYA.
Mr.
CYA. Gordy, it's the CYA, not the...
CYR. CYY. We got it, Mr. Speaker, now. But, Mr. Speaker, I'll leave you, Mr. Speaker, as I wrap this up for the evening, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to keep going, and if that's the case, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to keep going. Mr. Speaker, that Minister of Community Services said in this legislature over here one day, when I was sitting here, and I remember him saying, Cape Breton will get its fair share of affordable housing. Does anybody in here remember that? Cape Breton will get its fair share. The fair share again, zero. That's zero. So maybe now that we got a Cape Breton Premier, he might build us a unit or two. That's fair? He might build us a unit or two. You know, Mr. Speaker, what I'm going to do, Mr. Speaker, I guess, is I had enough for... I'm going to move adjournment of debate at this time, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Motion is to adjourn debate. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Contrary minded? I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I move the House to now rise to meet again on the morrow at the hour of 1 p.m. The House will sit from 1 until 5. And, Mr. Speaker, just to refresh everybody's memory, we will come into the House at 1, deal with the budget and the start of the of the response to the budget, then we'll wind up and adjourn that debate and go into the daily routine, followed by question period, and perhaps some second reading on the Justice Minister's bills, if time permits. With that, Mr. Speaker, I move the House to now rise.
Motion is for the House to adjourn till 1 p.m. tomorrow. Is it agreed? It is agreed. House is adjourned until tomorrow.